Samuel Hale had never considered himself the type of man to fall so easily into distraction. Retirement, he'd promised himself, would be simple: mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons tending his modest garden, evenings with a stack of mystery novels by the fire. But when Vivienne arrived, her hair pulled back in a neat braid, eyes sharp yet warm, he felt the first ripple of unease in years. She wasn't hired for anything beyond organizing his bills, scheduling his modest appointments, and ensuring the house remained presentable. And yet, from the very first day, Samuel felt compelled to notice her presence beyond practicality. She moved through the house with a kind of quiet efficiency, cataloging receipts, wiping counters, and folding laundry in ways that seemed almost ritualistic. Her voice, light but confident, gave directions not with command but with suggestion, a subtle authority that unsettled Samuel more than he expected. When she handed him a freshly filled envelope of bills, her fingertips brushed his, and he felt a strange warmth, like the crackle of static in the air before a storm. He chastised himself immediately: she was simply doing her job. But the thought lingered, persistent and uninvited. It was during an unusually hot September afternoon that he realized he had begun to pay attention to the smallest details of her life. The way she tucked a stray hair behind her ear, the faint hint of lavender that clung to her sleeves, the way her smile lingered just a little too long when she recounted a story about her niece. Every gesture seemed to weave itself into Samuel's consciousness, tugging him from his habitual solitude. He told himself it was admiration, perhaps loneliness speaking through him, but the truth felt sharper, more urgent. One evening, after Vivienne had finished preparing the kitchen for dinner, Samuel found himself offering her an iced tea. She accepted with a small nod, and for a brief moment, the distance between employer and employee seemed to vanish. Their conversation started with the mundane: weather, town events, an upcoming harvest festival, but it drifted, almost imperceptibly, into personal territory. She spoke of her family, her dreams, her quiet frustrations at the monotony of small-town life. Samuel, in turn, shared fragments of his own history, carefully choosing memories that revealed longing without vulnerability. And yet, by the time the tea was finished, he sensed he had crossed some invisible threshold. He was no longer merely her employer, he was a man aware of desire. It wasn't the kind of passion that ignites in novels or movies. It was slow, deliberate, threaded with hesitation and shame. Samuel began paying for little extras: a carefully chosen book, a gift certificate to the local cafe, an extra tip when she went beyond her duties. Vivienne never asked, never hinted, but she accepted with polite grace, a quiet acknowledgement that he was seeking more than efficiency in her presence. Each transaction carried an unspoken weight, a subtle recognition of the imbalance of power, the precarious line he was crossing. The town itself seemed to conspire with the tension. Willow Creek, with its quiet streets and neatly trimmed hedges, held an almost suffocating intimacy. Neighbors waved from across lawns, local storekeepers commented on minor events, and gossip drifted through the autumn air like the scent of burning leaves. Samuel could not escape the awareness that every small choice, every glance, every gesture, might be noticed, misinterpreted, or revealed. Yet the pull of Vivienne's presence was stronger than the fear of social scrutiny. He remembered one particular afternoon when she helped him organize a stack of letters. The room smelled of paper and dust, sun slanting through the blinds in golden stripes. As she bent over a letter, Samuel noticed the curve of her neck, the soft line of her jaw. And he felt an absurd, almost painful yearning. He quickly looked away, fumbling with the papers. Heart pounding with a mix of guilt and longing. That evening, he sat on the porch, replaying the moment in his mind. Wondering how something so ordinary could feel so charged. Yet, amidst the growing tension, Samuel was painfully aware of boundaries. Vivienne was not, and would never be, his. She was young, independent, and entirely her own person. Every action he took, every payment beyond her wages, was a confession of desire he did not dare articulate. He began to notice the little costs accumulating, both monetary and emotional. The more he gave, the more he felt his self-restraint fraying. Until he realized that he had been paying for far more than her presence. He was paying for moments of imagined intimacy. For the thrill of being noticed by someone who had the power to walk away at any moment. Weeks passed, each day a careful dance of polite conversation, lingering glances, and restrained gestures. Samuel tried to immerse himself in the mundane, gardening, reading, tending to household chores, but Vivienne's presence was inescapable. At night, he lay awake listening to the quiet hum of the house, replaying conversations, imagining touches that never occurred, wondering if she felt even a fraction of what he did. It was during one of these sleepless nights that he acknowledged the truth: he was deeply, irrevocably entangled. She was not hired for love. Yet he found himself paying anyway, paying in money, in attention. In the silent surrender of his heart to a woman who had entered his life under the guise of duty. And with that acknowledgement came a quiet fear: desire had consequences. And in Willow Creek, secrets rarely stayed buried for long. The autumn air thickened with anticipation. And Samuel understood that the choices he made in the coming weeks would determine not only his solitude but the fragile equilibrium of their shared world. Vivienne, unknowingly, had become the axis around which his late-life desires spun, and he, despite every attempt at reason, was powerless to resist. The crispness of October settled over Willow Creek, painting the town in shades of amber and ochre. Samuel Hale moved through his home with a quiet deliberation. Yet the awareness of Vivienne's presence lingered like a gentle hum he could not ignore. She had settled into her role with an ease that both impressed and unnerved him. The way she organized the study, rearranged papers, or straightened cushions carried a subtle grace. A precision that made the house feel alive in ways he had forgotten it could be. One late afternoon, Samuel found himself in the kitchen, attempting to prepare a simple dinner of roasted vegetables and chicken. Vivienne moved past him, her steps soft against the wooden floor, carrying a small basket of fresh herbs. The scent of thyme and rosemary mingled with the aroma of roasting food, and he became acutely conscious of her proximity. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for a cutting knife, and he chastised himself for letting such trivial encounters stir anything beyond polite attentiveness. Yet Vivienne had begun to notice the small ways Samuel's attention lingered. When she placed a neatly folded napkin on the counter, he caught himself staring a moment too long. When she laughed at one of his dry, self-deprecating jokes, the sound lingered in his mind far longer than it should have. Each interaction, seemingly innocent, took on a weight that neither fully acknowledged. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Samuel decided to offer Vivienne a small gift, a leather-bound notebook he had purchased at the local bookstore. He presented it casually, as though it were merely a token of thanks for her hard work. She accepted it with a polite smile. Yet her eyes held a flicker of something he could not quite name. The exchange was brief, yet the tension it left in the air was palpable, thickening the space between them in a way words never could. Days turned into weeks and the pattern persisted. Samuel found excuses to linger in the same rooms as Vivienne, to share meals with her, to ask her opinion on trivial matters that had little to do with the functioning of the house. Each small moment felt loaded with possibility, each glance a silent conversation. He began to realize that he was not merely paying her for services rendered. He was investing in her presence, in the moments when the world outside seemed to fade, leaving just the two of them suspended in a quiet intimacy. Even as he grappled with these feelings, Samuel remained painfully aware of propriety. Vivienne was young, independent, and entirely her own person. His awareness of the imbalance between them, his age, his position, the small-town scrutiny that could descend upon any misstep, kept him restrained. Even as desire simmered beneath the surface, he began to recognize the dual nature of his payments. They were both literal and metaphorical, a mixture of gratitude, attraction, and unspoken longing. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the parlor, Samuel found Vivienne arranging a stack of letters. The sunlight caught the curve of her neck, the soft sweep of her hair, and he felt a familiar, almost painful stir of longing. He quickly looked away, focusing on the mundane task of sorting papers. Yet his mind replayed the image long after she had left the room. The feeling was intoxicating and infuriating in equal measure, a reminder that desire, once awakened, did not easily subside. The small town itself seemed to heighten the tension. Willow Creek's narrow streets, familiar neighbors, and intimate social circles meant that even trivial interactions could carry weight. Samuel was aware that any misstep, any overt expression of his feelings, could become fodder for gossip, yet the allure of Vivienne's presence proved difficult to resist. He began to navigate the days with a careful balance, giving her small tokens, sharing quiet conversations, and cherishing fleeting moments that were, in truth, more precious than he dared admit. Late at night, he would sit by the window, the town silent beneath the glow of street lamps, replaying the interactions of the day. He imagined touches that had not occurred, conversations that had not been spoken aloud, and the thrill of connection that hovered on the edge of propriety. Each day reinforced the truth he could not ignore: Vivienne had become an axis in his life, a presence that both excited and unsettled him, and he was powerless to resist the magnetic pull she exerted. And so, as October deepened into early November, Samuel Hale continued his careful dance of attention and restraint, caught between propriety and longing, between the simple rhythms of retired life and the intoxicating presence of a woman who had entered his world not for love, yet had become the center of his quiet obsession. Autumn in Willow Creek had a way of making the ordinary feel charged with possibility. The amber leaves crunched beneath Samuel Hale's shoes as he walked toward the small farmer's market downtown, the crisp air carrying the scent of cider and baked bread. He had initially gone to pick up ingredients for dinner, but found himself scanning the stalls with Vivienne in mind. A jar of local honey, a bundle of fresh herbs, even a small pumpkin, all seemed like trivial purchases until he imagined her reaction. Her smile, the subtle acknowledgement in her eyes. Vivienne had begun to spend more time outside of the household duties, assisting Samuel with errands, cataloging his growing collection of letters, and occasionally offering her insight on matters he would normally handle alone. Each interaction was laced with an almost imperceptible tension. She remained professional, yet the curve of her smile or the lingering glance over a ledger spoke volumes. Samuel found himself increasingly aware of the gap between what was said and what was felt, a space charged with unspoken desire and cautious restraint. One evening, after a long day of organizing papers and preparing meals, Samuel suggested they take a walk along the narrow streets near the creek that gave the town its name. The sun had dipped low, casting a golden haze over the rooftops, and the water reflected the light like molten metal. They walked in companionable silence, though Samuel's mind buzzed with the awareness of her nearness. The air carried the faint scent of her perfume, and he imagined how close they might be if propriety were suspended. During their walk, Vivienne spoke of her childhood in a neighboring town, of her parents' small garden and her brother's stubborn streak. Samuel listened, genuinely engaged. Yet he could not ignore the tension that coiled in his chest. The normalcy of the conversation, stories of childhood, of mundane experiences, felt intimate in ways that defied logic. He found himself wanting to linger near her, to extend the walk beyond its natural conclusion. Yet he constrained himself with the weight of years and social expectation. Back at home, the dynamic between them became more nuanced. Samuel began to notice the deliberate ways Vivienne moved about the house, the soft brushing of her fingers across counters, the subtle adjustment of his reading glasses when he appeared distracted. These small gestures, innocuous to an outsider, were amplified in Samuel's mind. Each moment felt like a test of his restraint, a challenge to the careful equilibrium he had tried to maintain since her arrival. In response, he continued his pattern of small offerings. A book here, a cup of coffee there. Sometimes an extra tip slipped into the envelope of her wages. These actions were both a means of expressing his appreciation and a silent acknowledgement of the feelings that could not be named. Vivienne accepted them without comment, her polite demeanor never betraying her awareness. Yet Samuel could not ignore the subtle cues, a lingering look, a softer tone of voice, that suggested she sensed the unspoken tension. One night, as he prepared to retire to his study, Samuel found Vivienne seated at the kitchen table, carefully cataloging a series of old letters and documents. The room smelled faintly of ink and parchment, the soft light from the lamp casting shadows across her face. Samuel lingered in the doorway, captivated by the quiet concentration etched into her features. He felt the familiar stir of longing, a mixture of admiration and desire that he struggled to suppress. Yet even in that moment, he reminded himself of the boundaries between them, of the propriety that dictated their interactions, and of the fragile trust that had allowed Vivienne into his home. The small town's rhythm seemed to mirror his inner tension. Willow Creek was a place where everyone knew each other's business, and even the most innocuous interactions could become topics of speculation. Samuel felt the omnipresence of these social eyes pressing on him, a reminder that any misstep could have consequences far beyond his personal embarrassment. Yet the desire for Vivienne's company, for her subtle acknowledgement, was a force that defied reason. Late at night, Samuel would sit by the window, reflecting on the day's interactions. He replayed conversations, imagined touches that never occurred, and marveled at the intensity of feelings that could arise from ordinary moments. Vivienne had become more than an assistant. She was a presence that stirred emotions he had long thought dormant, an axis around which his quiet life had begun to revolve. As October gave way to November, Samuel recognized the precarious balance he maintained. Every gesture, every conversation, and every small gift carried weight. A silent negotiation of desire and restraint. He understood that the coming weeks would test his self-discipline, and that the simple routines of retirement could no longer contain the complex emotions. Vivienne's presence had awakened. The first frost of November settled over Willow Creek, dusting the edges of the town's narrow streets and sending plumes of breath into the crisp morning air. Samuel Hale, despite his habitual early rising, found himself restless. His thoughts, as they so often had in recent weeks, returned to Vivienne. He tried to bury the awareness of her presence beneath the routines of the day, checking bills, tending to the small garden behind the house, dusting shelves, but each glance, each shared silence with her seemed to echo in his mind. It was during one particularly quiet afternoon that the tension between them became undeniable. Vivienne had been arranging books on a low shelf in the study when Samuel entered with a basket of freshly laundered linens. She looked up, eyes meeting his, and for a moment the air seemed to thicken. He felt the familiar, disconcerting warmth in his chest, a stir of longing that had grown too persistent to ignore. He reminded himself firmly of the boundaries, her role in his life, his age, the watchful eyes of the town, but the thought offered little solace. Their conversations had begun to take on a different cadence. Where once they had been strictly about tasks and errands, now there was a subtle layering of personal detail, almost like a private language. Samuel noticed the way Vivienne's laughter carried differently when she spoke with him. Softer yet intimate, and he became attuned to pauses, gestures, the smallest indications that she might be aware of the tension growing between them. He tried to rationalize his feelings, telling himself it was admiration, curiosity, or even loneliness, but the truth gnawed at him. Desire had entered his quiet life, unbidden and unrelenting. One evening, as the amber glow of sunset spilled across the kitchen, Samuel decided to prepare a special meal. He chose a recipe he had once enjoyed with his late wife, attempting to recreate the familiar flavors while hoping Vivienne might notice the care he took. She watched quietly, assisting when asked, her movements measured yet graceful. Each glance in his direction carried a weight, subtle yet undeniable. The meal, like so many of their interactions, became a ritual of unspoken tension, a negotiation between propriety and longing. Samuel's attempts to maintain control often faltered. A gift, a small, hand-bound journal, a jar of local preserves, or a neatly folded scarf, became more than tokens of gratitude. They were expressions of emotion he could not articulate aloud. Vivienne accepted them with gentle acknowledgement, never probing, never questioning. Yet the small signs, the flicker of recognition in her eyes, a slight hesitation in her voice, suggested she sensed the unspoken dialogue unfolding. The town itself seemed to heighten the stakes. Willow Creek was intimate in ways that made privacy nearly impossible. Neighbors' greetings carried veiled curiosity. Casual conversations at the market hinted at awareness beyond the surface. Samuel was keenly aware that even minor displays could ripple outward, creating a web of scrutiny from which there was no escape. Yet the draw of Vivienne's presence proved stronger than caution. One night, after the house had settled into silence, Samuel found himself lingering in the study, listening to the quiet hum of the heater and the occasional rustle of Vivienne's movements in the next room. His mind replayed fragments of the day, her laugh over a simple joke, The way she had brushed past him to retrieve a book. The warmth of her glance as she handed him a cup of tea. Desire, he realized, had seeped into every corner of his life, entwining itself with routine and habit until it could not be ignored. He began to see the cost of his affections. Each moment of attention, each small gift, each deliberate act of consideration carried a weight that went beyond money. He was paying with his emotions, with his self-restraint, with the quiet surrender of control that had defined his orderly life. Vivienne, unknowingly, had become the axis around which his days revolved. And Samuel was acutely aware that he was powerless to resist her. As November deepened, he found himself navigating a delicate balance between propriety and longing, between social expectation and personal desire. The town's eyes, the quiet domestic routines, and the rhythm of the seasons all pressed against him. Yet he could not abandon the silent connection he had nurtured with Vivienne. She had entered his life professionally, but she had awakened something profoundly personal. And Samuel understood, with a mix of fear and anticipation, that the coming weeks would reveal just how far he was willing to go, and how much he was prepared to pay for her presence.